Nearly everyone has something to say about the press these days. See if you agree with the views of my show guests on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to the show. President Trump probably popularized the term fake news, but many groups in this country, whether on the right or the left or somewhere in between, have conflicting views about the news media and the accuracy of the information they're receiving from the media today. Certainly, the press and individual journalists are at times under assault, literally and figuratively, for a variety of reasons. On this show, I'll talk with a professional journalist and two Stanford students interested in the field of communications about some of the criticisms currently leveled at the media and what journalists can do to increase their credibility and gain the public's trust in the coverage of the news. Starr Jianga, seated to my left, is an undergrad at Stanford University, majoring in computer science with a concentration in human-computer interaction. Her past work includes designing a desktop robot that mentors mental health and prototyping a voice interactive earpiece that guides people through new experiences. She's interested in exploring how technology can help individuals lead more creative lives and give them space to share their stories. Claire Thompson, seated on my right, is a master's student in environmental communication. She started off studying earth science with a focus on food and agriculture, but is now pursuing a career in journalism. Claire currently works as an editorial intern at GRIS, an independent environmental news outlet based in Seattle. Akilah Johnson, who's seated on my far right, covers the intersection of race, politics, youth, and immigration for the Boston Globe. Her work includes stints on the Spotlight investigative team and on the on-the-ground reporting from Ferguson, Missouri, Charleston, South Carolina, Flint, Michigan, Haiti, and Cape Verde. She was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting in 2018 and contributed to the Globe's Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. She's currently a John S. Knight Journalism Fellow at Stanford. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yes. So would you agree right now that there's animosity towards the press in general?
I mean, I think there's animosity towards the press right now. I think there has been a growing distrust of media that's been going on for a while that precedes the current administration. If you look at polls and reports that have been going on, and specifically and certainly in certain communities, there's always been kind of a tension point between legacy media in particular and the communities that they serve or don't serve or misrepresent sometimes when they serve. So I think nothing is happening in a vacuum and nothing has happened in isolation. It's kind of been a continuum, and it is more palpable probably right now than it has been, but it's kind of a situation that has been brewing and stirring for a while.
Starr, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's not so much about the animosity, but the fact that news outlets today, they deliver very polarized news, and people, depending on their beliefs, go to certain news sources in a way they're just constantly feeling what they already believe, and it doesn't allow them to think outside of their headspace. And that creates that kind of animosity because being unable to see the other side they start to either they look at the other side and say, wow, that's not what I agree with, and what you're doing is wrong. So creating those kinds of binaries, the news media often does that, yeah.
So would you agree with that, Claire?
I'd agree with that for sure, with both points. And I think for those reasons and others, there's probably a lot of frustration is how I would characterize it with the news. And like Akilah was saying, probably more so in certain communities than in others, frustration with a lack of robust coverage or nuanced coverage, frustration with the amount of fake news, definitely.
So when you talk about robust coverage, what do you mean?
So when I think about robust coverage, I think coverage that offers multiple viewpoints, that's not too narrow, that includes many sources, and this starts to get into a project that we're working on, but coverage that is really representative of many sides of an issue in a community.
Sure. Now, Akilah, Starr just talked about media outlets being polarizing and maybe presenting news that's polarizing. How would you describe the Boston Globe's coverage?
Well, I mean, I think the Boston Globe, I would like to think that we get it more right than we do wrong, but I'm not going to say we get it totally right, because we are an organization made up of people, and people are inherently fallible. We make mistakes, right? So nothing is perfect, and there's always room for improvement. But I think both Claire and Starr touched on some kind of key critical points. Like when you talk about robust coverage, I think quite often we don't realize that includes, and particularly in certain communities, communities of color, low-income communities, communities that tend to not have the strongest relationship, have some historical tensions with legacy news organizations. The coverage falls into some very specific buckets that kind of creates this narrow view and narrow narrative of a neighborhood, right? Crime, poverty, subpar schools, struggling schools, right? So as opposed to focusing on overall quality of life issues, focusing or talking about
No, what people would say, or what news organizations would say, is that it's that type of news, the idea, if it bleeds, it leads, that captures the public's attention. And it's that type of news that might sell newspapers, or it's that type of news that's blaring out at you when the news show starts, that captures your attention and keeps people looking.
So I would push back on that, because yes, all right, if it bleeds, it leads has always been kind of a motto that you hear a lot when it comes to news. But when you ask if the Globe does it right, so the Spotlight series that we were finalists for in 2018 for the Pulitzer Prize in Local Reporting was this really in-depth, robust look at Boston's Black community. And we focused kind of on really examining the institutions that the city prides itself on. So we looked at hospitals, we looked at colleges and universities, we looked at kind of power structures, government power structures, corporate boardrooms, that sort of thing. We really were kind of taking aim community development. And that was one of the most widely read series and pieces of journalism that we produced in that year. And it also had a really high subscription conversion rate. And so what that says to me is that people are not just looking for news that screams, if it bleeds, it leads, but they're looking for the in-depth, nuanced coverage that goes kind of to Starr's point, that gets outside of this binary, that does help expand your worldview and teach you something that maybe you didn't know.
So in an era where we have Twitter, with
Yes.
you can't say very much, and Facebook and social media where you can only share bits and pieces of information, and we've been brought up too with sound bites. Who's going to take the time, and this generation doing less and less reading, who's going to be the one reading, paying attention to the in-depth news that you all were talking about?
Well, I think that in a lot of ways, I think that the sites that you've just mentioned, like Facebook, Twitter, recently there's been a lot of news about like how these sites have been perpetuating fake news, and how there's like a lack of censorship in that degree, and this question of censorship, should these platforms be censored? Because a lot of people have been taking those beliefs to heart and actually causing damage in the real world with those beliefs as we've seen. And I think in some ways I agree with that, that I think these companies that...
You agree with what?
I agree that the companies that are basically the platforms should be more closely monitored and like have some sort of way to be able to take fake news and be able to label it as such, because sometimes people, when they look at it, they don't know what they're...
No, you talk about monitoring, and some would say, well, that's censorship. No, monitoring the news, and who's going to be monitoring the news? Who's going to be trusted to monitor the news?
We monitor the news now. Everything is not fit to print. We don't print everything in newspapers. We don't put everything on television, right? There are certain things that I would not be allowed to say in this setting because of FCC regulations. And so I think we have to think about it sometimes in that context. We are always kind of monitoring what we say. And so because
Who?
we society in a lot
Like
of ways.
Trump, President Trump is monitoring what he says, and his followers are monitoring what they say?
I think in terms of when it comes to news organizations is how I am, when I say we, that's the space that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the president per se or his followers. I'm talking about respectable, credible news organizations. And so my ethos has always been, if I wouldn't scream in an elevator, I'm not going to tweet it, because in essence, that's what you're doing, is screaming something in an elevator. And as journalists, I think we have that responsibility to consider the same core values that we have and apply them in innovative spaces the same way we would apply them in kind of legacy
would
spaces.
you agree with that? Or you talk about nuanced reporting and, well, what is nuanced? When you talk about nuanced reporting as opposed to robust reporting?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I definitely agree with the points about censorship. But to your point about this sort of in an age of sound bites and tweets, et cetera, who's going to consume really robust, lengthy reporting? I think that's an interesting question, and I think the answer is actually surprising that people do want that. Like Akilah was saying, I think there's a hunger for that for sure. And I would even say my take on it is kind of in an age in the digital space where everybody's competing for attention, it's so easy for people just to toggle over to Facebook or Twitter and get, tons of stimulation. And if the news is offering that same stuff, like, quick bites, which they have to, they have to tweet out their content and exist in those realms as well. But if the news becomes just basically another space to get that, I think it'll be harder to compete for people's attention.
No, I would think you're going to say something else.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think when the news does go to that really deep, like lengthy, thoughtful reporting, I think they actually find that people will consume that. Like when Mother Jones put out their, 50,000 report on private prisons, people read it. Tons of people read the whole thing. People spent a long time on that page consuming that content.
Now, if you're going to do lengthy, in-depth investigative reporting, well, then it seems that there's even more of a responsibility to get it right. So, what assurances or what guidelines will be in place to ensure that this is the news that's being put out can be believed, that it's going to be truthful, it's not going to be biased, that it's going to be factual? Because, if you're really going to do something in depth, that assumes more of a responsibility for the output.
Well, I mean, I think if you are doing something in depth, and by in depth that means talking to a variety of people, and also looking at a variety of sources. So you're looking at documents, you're looking at court cases, you're pulling statistics off of websites like the census statistics or federal statistics or local statistics. So if you're...
Isn't all of that selective?
getting it. So what I'm saying is, if you're getting information from a variety of places, and then you're producing it, there's an internal credibility that's built into the reporting, particularly if I'm citing where these sources are coming from, versus if you don't have that type of internal credibility in what's happening and what is being produced. But there are also a lot of tools that are being created to help kind of validate the credibility of sources that or publications, news stories that don't do that, right? So there are a variety of things that are coming out now in the internet, and have been, that are, people are sitting in rooms just like writing things and just putting information out there, which I think maybe is what you're talking about.
Well,
but there's no
do you
internal
know,
credibility
yes,
structure.
yes, but you know, there is this idea that started maybe about a decade ago of community reporters. And so if you're going to have community reporters, what does that imply? That you're going to have maybe individuals from the community who are going to be sitting down talking about what's going on in their communities and what their viewpoints are?
Yeah, I think that this idea of one reporter being able to tell a story, or one reporter being responsible for that story, is not really the right way to look at it. And this ties back to our work when we're trying to expand the sources we're using in articles or stories, that these reporters can go to these people in the community and be able to seek out stories from them and then write about them. And I think that's a really important aspect of reporting as well, that it's very collaborative, because you're never telling a story about yourself. You're usually telling a story about a community, a people, a place, and there's always a lot of people there. And it's important to take into account that you are speaking on behalf of them, and therefore you must include them in the conversation as well.
So Claire, we haven't heard from you. Anything you'd like to add to the subject?
Sure, I'll just throw out one of my favorite quotes of the moment, which is, "Transparency is the new objectivity." And I think that...
I like that.
Thanks.
I'm good.
I like that.
I think when Akilah was talking about earlier about the Boston Globe and how, you know, reporters are all people, and people are fallible, and people are also biased, and in a lot of ways there's no way around that. You know, I think in journalism we try to be really objective, you know, really just sort of lay out the facts and not give too much of our own perspective to it. But journalists are sort of curators of information, and we all come with our own biases, and even, like Starr was saying earlier, certain outlets are associated with certain leanings. And you know, we can't avoid that, but we can be transparent about it. We can, we've been taking a class on computational journalism. We can be really...
Which kind? Confrontation?
Oh, computational.
Oh, computation.
All journalism is a little confrontational.
And journalists are confrontational and lose their press passes sometimes. Computational. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And if you could explain it.
Sure, yeah. It's a sort of a broad term, and I'm still learning about it myself. But, oh, sorry, I just tapped my microphone. But anyways, so I'm thinking about like data journalism, and just being transparent about how you got the story, how you came to the facts, and even, you know, what your own perspective is when relevant. If you're using first person in a story, I think it's appropriate sometimes to call out your own you know, feelings or your own approach to a topic.
Starr talked about the work you're doing. So let's get into it. What work are you doing, and how did it start, and why do you think it's important?
Yeah.
What is it adding to
Yes.
the quality of journalism?
Yeah, so what we've been doing, we're a team of 4 students and obviously a JSK fellow, and we're basically trying to build a database of sources right now, specifically of East Palo Alto. And we chose East Palo Alto because we had a very lengthy conversation about which location we would try this database on first. And we chose East Palo Alto partly because it was close to Stanford, so we would have easy access to the people there, but also because we felt like it was a place that was close to us that we didn't know a lot about. And in that way, it was very personal to us as well, because we wanted to know more about this place that we just sometimes just take for granted because we live in the other side of Palo Alto. And so we're building a database of sources, which basically means we're right now sending out a survey to the city where we're asking people about their interest, like what kinds of fields are they in? For example, like are they into politics? Are they into the community well-being, faith, things like that? And then asking them if they know anybody that can speak on those kinds of topics. And this is like kind of a vetting process, having community members be able to vet their own sources instead of saying, oh, I just read about the mayor. I actually know these people in the community that I know can talk about these things.
It sounds very intrusive in terms of getting information on people.
Does it?
So,
What
yes.
makes it seem intrusive?
Well, first of all, you're collecting a database, and databases are always, they're kind of archives, collections of information. And when you're going into a community, asking people, well, who are you? What are you interested in? Isn't that all kind of personal?
Isn't that what reporting is? Don't most reporters have a Rolodex where you go out and you have to talk to people and you have to say...
If you're talking about, let's say, investigating a specific topic, you do want to have your contacts. But in this particular case, you're having a database of the community.
It's interesting because I look at it as a reporter. I already have a database. It's more of a digital shortcut and a digital front ending to what really is traditional beat reporting. Because beat reporters have these repositories.
They have a beat. It's very selective. It's not something that's community-wide.
Well, so let's say if my beat was East Palo Alto, I would have to have a community-wide understanding and a community-wide network of people to go to get to the robust coverage that Claire is talking about so that I better understand what's happening in the community.
So people are concerned now, let's say, what the collection of information that Google has, that Facebook has,
That's fair.
that apps have. So what's the difference? And where will the database be maintained?
So these are all things that we're like trying to figure out because as of right now, in this collection process, this is kind of seeing if it works, right? If this is something that is even a possibility that there would be interest in, if we could get a community to participate in, and then once we do, is it scalable and replicable in other places? So right now, the information that we have is not being used for any sort of like public consumption. It's not like Google, it's not like Facebook, in that
it's not going to be used to get more advertising.
Exactly, right?
It's not going to be used as a database for the FBI or the police.
Exactly. And we had a real robust conversation about privacy issues. Like we really talked about privacy and these issues in terms of how, if we were to scale this, what do we do with this information? And one of the things we talked about was giving people the option of opting out of sharing their information more widely, as in, would you be willing to have a reporter contact you directly? Like, would you be willing to be a source? And some people have said no, and you have to respect that. But they also have said, if I were going to somebody for information on housing, on healthcare, on public safety, these are the people who I would go to.
So what kind of questions are you asking them? I mean, what type of information are you collecting? Once people say, yes, I'll be a source.
Sure. So pretty much we're just collecting contact, like a simple email or phone number, a way for a reporter to reach them, basically, if they were working on a story. And then beyond that, like Akilah was saying, we're also asking people to sort of lead us in other directions. We've been calling it like breadcrumbs. So we ask them, who would you recommend a reporter contact for expertise on this community topic? And then we're trying to sort of expand it out that way.
And why do you think this is important?
Well, on the other end of this project, we've been scraping a lot of larger news sources that are more well known in this area, such as the SF Chronicle, Mercury News. And we've been basically going through their articles from the past year with a tag of East Palo Alto, and using some computation, we've been trying to drag out which sources are used in these articles and what kinds of sources pop up the most. And what we've noticed from doing that scraping is that usually the sources we get in news are people in a lot of power, people with a lot of influence, and people with a lot of money. So we're talking like leadership, like the mayor, the chief of the police office. We get a lot of tech CEOs. A lot of times are very well represented in the news, such as like Mark Zuckerberg. And a lot of times you have these people in power speaking about issues that impact just locals. Like a lot of articles about gentrification in East Palo Alto, for example, the people speaking in those articles are like the mayor and these tech CEOs, but we never hear from the community members themselves of like what is going on. And the goal of building this database is so we can bring that nuance to stories and we can understand what the people are going through and not just hear the story from these people in power.
Well, those people in power are the ones who are shaping policy, right? So it is important to hear from them, right?
But it's also important to hear from the people who are impacted by the policies that they're shaping to find out if the policies that are being in place have the intended effect and impact. So you can't really address a policy without talking to the people who are directly affected by it.
And what do you plan to do with that information?
We are still figuring that out. we are still very much in the process of trying to, right? So we're doing this for a class. So right now we are doing this for a class. We are saying if this is something that could even work. You know, you come up with an idea kind of in theory, and so we don't want to just be sitting in an ivory tower in this elite space saying this is something that we think should be happening. Well, let's see if it is something that people are actually receptive to, want, need, and respect. And so that's where we are, is still trying to figure out. We think the need is maybe there. We think that people are receptive to it, but then what do we do with it, and how do you scale it?
Sure.
How do you
Now,
grow it?
let's go back and talk about getting people's reactions, getting their experiences, getting them to share it. Why do you think that would be important information in a news article or in a television broadcast? I think one of you might have said earlier that these are people who aren't usually represented. Why? How would their sharing of information be enlightening to those who might be reading the stories? Or
Yeah. Well, so I'll just add. Also, you mentioned how it's important to have sort of the usual suspects included in coverage, like the people who are in power, and that's certainly true. We're not presenting unusual sources as like a total alternative to the usual sources. You know, you can't not reach out to those sort of like keystone people, but having the nuance of other perspectives that are maybe not as loud and even, you know, in a minority, I think is still important, because it just shows, it's representative, right, of what the community is actually experiencing. And I think it also has a lot to do with community health. You know, if there's robust news coverage and people are seeing their perspectives and people that they listen to and trust represented in the news, I think it's beneficial for a community's well-being and a community's understanding of other parts of the community. And when people see their viewpoints not being represented in the news, I think it can be very harmful and makes people want to scream louder on Twitter or Facebook, and sometimes.
so do you think that has been something quite common in traditional media where people's voices aren't represented?
I do. I think they aren't represented, or if they're represented, they're misrepresented in some ways, right? So I think one of the things that we have talked about, right, so we're doing this for a computational journalism class. I, as a JSK fellow, have kind of an area of interest and study that kind of exceeds that. And so one of the things I'm wondering is this enough? Because you can have a diverse array of sources, you can have a diverse array of voices in a story, but how are you framing the story? How are you presenting that information? Are you still perpetuating a narrative that's limited in scope, despite having a variety of voices in there?
How, as a journalist, would you suggest one come to terms with that question? For example, it seems like you're asking yourself, okay, I have all of these resources. I've heard these stories, now I'm putting it together how could a journalist put it together so that it doesn't reflect a specific bias?
I mean, I think part of that has to do with putting it together as the information presents itself to you, right? So I think sometimes as journalists, we go into a story with preconceived notions and we do kind of think, right? So as the reporting process happens, an editor or a reporter will say, I want to do a story about X. I'm interested in X. And sometimes the reporting doesn't lead you to X. Sometimes the reporting will lead you to Y or A, or it's not even in the alphabet. We're talking numbers and something completely different. But often we don't make the necessary pivot to allow the story to reflect where the information has taken us. And we still try to cram information into what we think the story would be, as opposed to allowing the information to kind of speak for itself.
And I think a lot of times you have suggested that story, maybe to an editor, right? And gotten permission or approval to write that story.
And then you feel wedded to come back with the story that
Yes,
you've pitched,
yes,
even if the reporting
yes.
doesn't bear out what you've pitched. And so, yes, that is,
So
it's
how
happened and
does
it's problematic.
what happens then?
I mean, you just, and it doesn't happen. I'm not going to say it happens often. I think we reporters and editors I would like to think that we are radical advocates for the truth, and that you go where the reporting takes you and you reflect that in the story. But I think even before you get there, sometimes it goes back to kind of the nuts and bolts of journalism, taking the time to call somebody, set up an appointment, sit and look somebody face to face, listen to what they're saying, report with all of your senses. So look around the room, see what's in the room that reflects the culture and attitudes of what's happening.
What do you do? And Starr, I'd like for you and Claire to chime in too. When you've pitched one story and the information takes you in another direction and you have to come back to the editor or whomever might be the news director and say, but this isn't the story, what we had thought about, this is the story. How do you make that pivot?
Yeah, I think I'll...
And get it accepted.
Yeah. Well, I'll speak to my limited experience. I think that happens for sure. It's always a conversation. I mean, if I were pitching a story and I didn't yet have all the facts, I would be thinking about it as like, this is what I think the story is going to be like. I'm interested in pursuing this further, but here's where I'm at, and I would be transparent about, not knowing fully how the story was going to take shape or if it was going to be worth the resources that I wanted to invest in it. And I think, and this is, me kind of talking out my head a little bit because I'm not an expert in this, but at that point, I think some stories probably get killed and they decide, we're not going to invest the time in this. Or if it turns out to be something even more interesting, then that's great. Or if it turns out to be something surprising, that's always great because it's news. But yeah, like Akilah was saying, I think it's important to, well, first to take a step back and acknowledge, like, if you're going into a story thinking, like, I really hope it turns out to be this way because it'd be such a great story, you should always be ready to take a step back and be surprised by what turns out to be the truth and be true to what actually is the story.
What the information is.
Yeah, I think like Claire brings up really good points about just that difference between truth and sensationalism. And like right now, like you mentioned earlier, news seems to like occupy that space of sensationalism a lot because of the sound bites, and people only pay attention to things that are interesting. And I think that it is on the part of these news outlets to maintain that integrity. And while that seems like something like easier said than done, obviously, in this day and age, I think there does need to be more attention made to do that. And I'm not a journalist. I obviously don't have any experience with that. But I think even as a citizen, that's what I would hope is happening. Because I think, like Claire earlier said too, people do listen when a story is truthful and deep and nuanced. Because when you feel represented, you feel more engaged. And that is basically what it means to be like a citizen of a community. And yeah, I think that's just very important.
So what we get to is what is news, and what can you encourage, let's say when you take a story back, the publisher or the news director to go with. For example, Akilah, you have worked in Florida. You were at Flint, Michigan, and various other places covering stories, especially in minority communities. And have you ever pitched a story and taken it back, and the news editor might have said, well, no, we don't want to cover that because that's not what, let's say, the traditional.
Sometimes not cover, and or sometimes you have to fight in terms of how something is presented. Case in point, when I was in Flint, I wanted to have this opening anecdote that with this gentleman whom I'd come in contact with, who happened to have a criminal record. And there was this large, kind of intense conversation with my editor about how we could have our opening anecdote be somebody who had a criminal record, especially for a paper, a national story. And I was pushing back heavily against that because what does that mean? Are we saying that he doesn't have a valid point of view? Are we saying his experience doesn't matter? Are we essentially silencing a community because he also represents a community who is directly impacted by this water crisis, and we're assigning value to what he is experiencing versus someone without a criminal record who is experiencing the same thing. And it was an intense conversation, and at the end of the day, he said, that is not going to be the lead anecdote. And it wasn't. But it was not for lack of trying, and it was not for lack of very intense lobbying on my part, conversations. And it was still included, it just wasn't the lead anecdote, because I was very passionate that you can't strip these voices out, particularly if you look at the demographics of some community. You're stripping out and eliminating the voices of large segments and swaths of people who live there, particularly as you kind of get into some of the issues with criminal justice system and how people get involved with the criminal justice system. I fervently believe you just can't do that. So,
well, let me just say, it's something that has been done.
Yes.
Over and over again.
It is a systemic
and
problem.
Yes, and not only are the voices stripped out, but maybe the voting possibilities are also.
Well, exactly.
Because you don't want certain voices to become powerful, right? Or to become influential.
I mean, Florida just you mentioned I worked in Florida, and I did. And so I went to college in Florida, and I worked at the Sun Sentinel in Florida for almost a decade, maybe more than a decade, a long time. And I don't want to age myself completely on your show, Henrietta, but let's just say it was a while. But the point,
it's the information.
The point is, I remember how contentious, and when talking about felons and voting rights, because at the time felons didn't have voting rights in Florida, they were stripped of their voting rights essentially in perpetuity. Well, just this past election cycle, the state voters voted onto a referendum that restored voting rights for felons, which is kind of a huge thing, right? Because what does that say in terms of the stake and the voice that you have to advocate on your behalf in your community? And I'm saying meaningful, not that there aren't other meaningful ways, but in kind of an actionable way with going to the ballot. And that often translates to news, right? That's what I mean in terms of where the rubber meets the road. You need to know those stories to understand how those policies are affecting people.
But at the same time, the system is set up in such a way that you talk about legacy media, that things have been treated a certain way for a reason. And you're coming along saying, well, we'd like to get more voices heard. What impact will that have? Getting more voices heard, getting more ideas out there in the public airways or in print. And what impact do you think that might have?
Well, I think on a very community level, there is a lot of value in seeing yourself represented in the stories being told. Like if I were someone, as someone in the community, if I felt like I was heard, I would feel more engaged and more inclined to be proactive in my community and speak up more about what I think should happen in my community.
Now, let me just say, if you're in a community and you feel that you were being heard, some people might say there would be no need for you to be proactive because you're already being heard.
I'm sorry, I don't really quite understand why.
What I'm saying is it could work the other way. See, you're saying if you feel that your voices are heard, that might encourage you to be more proactive in your community and get more involved.
Yes.
But what I'm saying is some might think that because your voice is being heard, that there's no need for you to be more active because your ideas are already out there.
So you feel like it's like, wow, you're already heard, therefore
Yes.
your influence is capped in that sense.
Yes.
Well,
I mean, sorry, go ahead, sorry.
yeah, I guess I would disagree with that because I think there is always more that you can do. I don't think it's like who are you saying that would say, okay, you're being heard. There's nothing more. Are you talking about like the leadership in that?
Well, how do you think, for example, you talk about when people's ideas are shared and they're out there.
Yes.
So they're shared and they're out there, what, in the newspaper? On television?
That's a really good question. I not just like media in general, but I think just to have something media is not the end road. It's that to be heard means that people know about what's going on. So it's like people actually have to be exposed to what they're reading or seeing. So yes, I guess that's what I imagine being represented means, that people know of your existence. It's not just your existence is published.
Oh, interesting. So how will people know of your existence?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is the struggle with media currently. It's that even if we do write these stories where people are represented, who is listening, right? And like I said, my argument for that is I think if people feel represented, they will be more proactive. And yes, that might...
Yes, it might. Go on.
Yeah, it might not be possible, and it's like it's easier said than done because I'm just talking of abstraction, but I think there is like that possibility that people will be more proactive in their communities if they feel like they're heard.
Okay, now you talked about, you just now mentioned the idea of who would be listening. And we have a situation in our country now of polarization, where people are in their own silos. And let's say you're listening to Fox News and you're not looking at MSNBC or NBC or for President Trump, CNN. And so how do you, once you tell these stories and you get people's ideas, how then do you get other people to listen?
Before we answer that question, I want to go back and pick up on what Starr's saying and this concept of if you're oversaturated with thoughts and opinions, it's somehow going to cause you to be less proactive in society.
Not if you're oversaturated. That's already a way of putting it, that it's oversaturation.
Well, because the premise of, if I'm understanding the premise of what you're saying, it's kind of like once your voice is in the newspaper, the argument is that somehow is going to say, oh, I'm heard, so now I don't need to be involved.
Yes, and that doesn't necessarily mean oversaturation.
But
it
what
just
I would
means
push
that
back
you
at-
have been given attention.
And what I would say is look at who has been given attention historically throughout the country and who's represented in media. Has that caused them to somehow disengage from society? So I would have a fundamental pushback against the whole premise and the way that question is shaped and formed, because based on that, based on that, then that would mean mean that like
what I'm
senior
thinking-
citizens would not be one of the most active voting contingents right now because they would see their issues represented in the newspaper, so therefore they would be like, I don't need to go to the polls because I'm heard, I don't need to be active. So that's why I'm kind of...
No, that it doesn't have to be taken to that extreme.
Okay.
But somebody might be quoted in the newspaper and their story shared, and they might think, okay, so my neighbors know what my situation is and what I feel, so my voice has been heard. And for this time, that idea is out there and I can go on to something else. I have communicated my feelings and my
then
ideas.
other people can say, aha, I hadn't thought of that before. Let me pick up that thread. Let me continue to engage with this person who possibly is going through a similar situation that I didn't know was happening out there, and let's strengthen and build community health.
That's the impact that it might have if that person gets back to the person who shared his or her ideas.
I guess I'm curious to if this, I've never heard, and that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I guess I'm just looking for more kind of concrete examples of instances where someone's issue gets out there and they retreat back into their own private space.
It all depends on what the reaction is.
Okay, that's fair. What the public reaction to putting that information out in kind of the public market and sphere is.
Because that will encourage the person to take the next step.
Well, then I think
have people reacted favorably to what I've said, or have they acted? Have they been antagonistic? For example, who is the CNN reporter who was just now fired because he put his ideas out there, and the feedback was in opposition to what he had to say? A lot of feedback in opposition. So depending upon what the feedback is, people might be very, very reluctant to share anymore.
So is that has something to do with social media and technology and the way we've created feedback loops and the way how what you say can be amplified beyond your local community and the local media landscape and ecosystem that you're saying it in? Is that what you're getting at?
I am sure that that's a part of it, but I think that also has been the case even before the current technology took place. Now, I'm not saying that sharing ideas and getting people's voices is a bad idea. I'm just asking you questions to get more information. And Claire, I've heard from Starr and I've heard from Akilah. I'm sure you have a lot to say.
Sure. So on the topic of sort of community feedback and yeah, I think, well, I have a lot of thoughts about it, but I think when and do we need to wrap up or?
No,
okay.
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
No.
Well, so when we're talking about how some people might feel afraid to share or might then, be inclined to sort of retreat after not getting favorable responses to their opinions, I think that that's okay because it's part of the community dialogue. And you know how sometimes people will say like, oh, I never post anything on social media because I'm so afraid I'm going to say something wrong and it'll be taken the wrong way. I think, well, I think that's okay. If you're going to say something hateful, you probably shouldn't be posting on social media. But also, if you make a mistake and that then leads to a conversation where everybody learns something, I think that's always a good thing. So, and it, this is sort of about social media, but news in a lot of ways is part of that conversation. And if you get a quote in the local paper that then somebody calls you up and they say, I disagree with what you had to say, that's an opportunity for understanding, for growth, for just engagement that I think is valuable.
What you're asking, it seems to me, is an opportunity for people who haven't been heard to have a voice and to share their ideas and to feel empowered.
Yes.
And these people that you're talking about are people who haven't felt empowered. And the people who are the ones that your data shows have been focused on a lot are the powerful, who are used to speaking up and being out there. So it's one thing to want to empower people, and it's another thing to say to them, it's okay. I mean, you're entitled to have your voice heard. And have you run into that reluctance? For example, the person with the criminal record.
Oh, I run into reluctance all the time, and I understand it. I run into a lot of people who say, I don't want to be quoted, I don't trust the media, how do I know you're going to characterize what I say accurately? I'll tell you what I think, but you can't use my name. And that goes back to those core tenets of journalism and engagement and kind of what Claire is talking about, which is an opportunity to engage. I get people who call and scream at me on the phone, people who have face-to-face confrontations. And I don't think we should back away or retreat from that. It's what and you have to, as a reporter, I think we have to understand that there are legitimate reasons and concerns that people would be reluctant. And in some instances, you have to respect that. And I think you have to engage with sources differently. I'm not going to engage with the profile of person you just said, someone who is not used that is not used to speaking out and maybe feels disempowered the same way that I engage with someone who is powerful and does have a lot of influence.
That kind of leads into my next question. How then do you get the people? How do you allay their fears, so to speak, and their hesitations and say, well, no, I'm not going to misquote you. It's not my intention to mischaracterize what you've said. How do you encourage those who want to be voiceless to speak up?
I think it kind of goes back to your earlier point about reporting being inherently intrusive. And honestly, in some ways I do agree with that this idea of someone else telling your story and not you telling it, it is intrusive and it can be violent. And I think because of that, there is a degree of trust in giving your voice to someone else to share. And I think it's like, how do we change that relationship we have with media so that it's not this way that reporters say to the people they're telling the people that they're telling their stories of, they tell them, I'm not speaking on behalf of you, but I'm speaking with you. And that can be really difficult. And I think in some ways, it makes more sense sometimes for reporters to be a part of the communities that they're speaking on behalf of, because then they do know. But of course, that's not the case.
Sometimes it is.
Yes, sometimes it is.
I think with Akilah, that might have been the case, was it?
I mean, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, right?
And sometimes would that even be suspect on the part of the editor, who's thinking, oh, you're not completely objective,
right?
Yes, exactly.
But I mean, to Starr's point, it is intrusive, and I think as a reporter, I acknowledge that intrusion. I think, like, to get to these points, in order to begin to build that trust, we as reporters have to acknowledge that this is intrusive. I am asking a lot from you, and I am asking you to put a huge amount of trust in me.
Yes, and given right now the attacks that have been directed at the media with a lot of pressure on journalists, how can journalists come out and be more credible? What do they have to do to earn the trust of the people they would like to interview, to earn the trust of the people they would want to talk with them, to say, no, this isn't, I'm not reporting the way you might have seen in previous stories. I'm trying to do this differently.
Well, I think there are a lot of ways to do that. I mean, I think part of it is putting out good content, building a relationship with your audience where they know that they can trust what you say and that you're going to do your due diligence with your coverage. Also, being a part of an institution like the Boston Globe or the New York Times, I think, carries a lot of weight. If you call somebody up and say, I'm a reporter with the New York Times, that's
It
really...
depends on what they think of the New York Times.
Definitely,
It
yeah.
depends on what they think of CNN or Fox News. Or
Sure. But yeah, I mean, being attached to an institution has advantages and disadvantages for sure. But in terms of clout, I think that can be, that's kind of an in sometimes. Maybe sometimes it's the reason you get hung up on. But I think another part of it is really personal. Like Akilah was saying, the trust and what you're asking somebody to give you when you interview someone, especially if it's a delicate story, a personal story, it's really personal. Just talking to somebody face to face about that stuff. I think it takes time. I think you really need to invest time to get the stories. I'm teaching a class right now. I'm a teaching assistant for a multimedia class, which is a whole other beast. When you have a camera, it's much more intimate. And I don't know why people ever agree to do it, but
or why you've agreed.
That's not what I meant. But yeah, to be the subject of a film, I think is an amazing thing that people give, an amazing gift. And yeah, I think you really need to spend time with people to get the full story. Spend time like without the camera on, maybe spend time without the notebook, getting to know people, and then start to. I mean, they know from the beginning that you're a reporter.
Building relationships.
I think so.
Okay, now in the time that we have left, I'd like for you to share maybe what you haven't shared. Talking about sharing, whatever information you think is important. Or it's something you might have said that you'd like to expand on in a brief way.
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about, very abstractly, about like the relationship between reporters and people, but I think I'd like to provide a very concrete example of the work we've done. In EPA, East Palo Alto, there's been this issue of gentrification. And I think most of us have a very general understanding of what that is. Mainly tech companies are coming into the area and taking up housing. But we've conducted a lot of interviews with people in East Palo Alto, and in some of the interviews, this issue of gentrification has come up. And in one specific interview I think Akilah did, a woman was saying, well, in the news it's always portrayed as tech companies coming in, we have no more housing because people here are poor and can't afford it. But there's actually much more nuance to that a lot of the housing displacement is caused by young folks of these tech companies who are on the hunt for cheap housing as well because they're early on in their careers and they can't afford anything expensive. And they choose to live in East Palo Alto because it's cheaper, and that's where this housing displacement comes in. But we never hear about that in the news.
No, we never hear about it, and we never hear about a lot of things. And I feel that this conversation with you, the two of you, the three of you, has been very, very enlightening. And it'll be interesting to see what will happen as you progress along the way with your project.
Yeah.
So I'd like to thank the three of you for joining me to talk about the media and what's on the horizon, what we can look for, what we should have. I'd also like to thank our viewers for watching. Until next time.